So I want to kind of introduce this as a whirlwind tour of simulation options for OB anesthesia. And I welcome any and all of you to come visit. I'll put my emails at the end, but we have a lovely new hospital, which we are not part of. We're still in the very old hospital at Lucille Packard down in the Bay. So if anybody's interested in learning more or being part of one of our instructor courses, you're welcome to come visit. I don't have any relevant financial disclosures, but I will mention that simulation at our institution has received a lot of encouraging support from our risk management group, and as well as from our different various grants that we use to fund our programs. I think it's very humbling to, as a provider in OB anesthesia, to recognize that every single patient that you take care of is coming to their delivery process with certain expectations. And even people who are well-informed, even people who are physicians, have certain expectations of what their experience is going to be like. But those of us who take care of pregnant women know that no matter whether they're healthy, uncomplicated pregnancies at a private practice hospital, or the highest risk patients that come to an institution like ours, the reality can be very different from their expectations. I can't show you that many videos of real patients, but I'm going to show a couple of quick clips of some of our simulations. So the reality is very complex, and I think it's powerful to realize that simulation can help groups of providers break down some of these complexities and really cut through the chaos that can make a difference between optimal care and less than optimal care. No matter how you look at it, there's so many opportunities for using simulation to take care of pregnant women. You can look at it by country or by state, by cause, and there's just so many options. The options are limitless. So I really want to go through some of these options, and all of them have pros and cons, like anything that we do with our time, and help you kind of feel like you could design some simulations that are meant for patient and provider safety and for satisfaction in your career. I feel extremely honored to be part of a multidisciplinary group of faculty that Dr. Abir, who's the next speaker, is also part of our group. But we have obstetricians and nurses, anesthesiologists, and other professionals that for over a decade have really run through a lot of the common simulation options. So this is just a list of the many things that have been simulated, and to give you an idea that the options are limitless. And pretty much everything that I'm talking about, besides some of the practical applications, are in this article that I will refer you to that we published a couple years ago in Anesthesia and Analgesia. So here's the first of two video clips that can show the complexity of this, and I just want to introduce a little bit because it is very complex, even though it's less than a minute long. And I'll probably show about 30 seconds of it for time, but everybody who's either scrubbed in or wearing an orange vest is a participant in the simulation, and the rest of us kind of standing on the perimeter are part of the faculty. So it looks a little bit crowded, probably because it's in one of our smallest operating room, but it's not that hard to imagine this much crowding in a high-risk delivery. And it almost doesn't matter what the case is, because the chaos can happen in multiple different emergencies on labor and delivery, but this happens to be a woman who just had a forceps delivery, and the anesthesiologists at the head of the bed are trying to sort out what they're going to do next. So we'll go ahead and play 30 seconds of that, please, Eric.
Who's the OB?
Okay, so let's call you.
Guys, does she have any hypertension?
I only see no hypertension. You want to see that after dinner? She has no
Is that been given?
Can we get some empathy, please?
While we're
Is it
looking at
using a
this, she
stool?
had forceps deliveries. But what's going on?
We're just trying to get the
Yes, have everything in order.
and we're just trying to make sure there's no bleeding coming from down below.
Need a ring, and then a ring for cervix, and have a
Okay, that's great. So it's almost hard for me to watch this because sometimes I feel bad putting people through some kind of stress, and and realizing that we're all put in that position when you deal with something. And the anesthesiologist at the head of their bed there is trying to talk to the patient. It's a plastic person. We have somebody being the voice of the patient in the back, but they're trying to kind of make sense of the dynamic situation to the patient. And then they have their resident in the background or fellow trying to dutifully do a lot of the anesthetic things, and the obstetricians are trying to kind of decide what to do next. And the nurses are relatively peripheral because they are also waiting to see what's going to happen, and they're trying to anticipate and plan for all the different possibilities. And we can create this kind of complexity in a situation that you can pause and you can talk to people about how they feel in the moment and talk to them afterwards. And it's just a really powerful way for teams to realize that the work that they do every day is really hard, and that they can beat themselves up about what they did or what they said or what they didn't do or what they didn't say. But it's real, and it's challenges that we all face. So I think there's increasing pressure to involve simulation because of its powerful abilities to deal with these issues. This is a ACOG practice bulletin that highly recommends multidisciplinary simulation-based training, which is a very overwhelming thing to come up with a program on your own. But it has multiple benefits that make it worthwhile to do over time. And some of the benefits that it reports, and it gives different mostly simulation-based references for these benefits, but are improved safety culture and outcomes, helping identify management pitfalls of both individuals and teams, and helping familiarize people with algorithms, whether they're new, old, or updated, and improving team confidence and competence. And then something that we feel is very powerful is piloting and modifying new checklists and other cognitive aids. And Jill is going to give a whole talk about identifying and correcting systems issues, but that is a really, really important one that I won't have that much time to touch on. And something that we were surprised pleasantly about is that with the institution of multidisciplinary simulation at our institution, we found that, and other safety interventions, to be fair, the blue line represents the annual deliveries. So with a relatively stable a number of annual deliveries, not including the financial crisis in like 2008, 2009, where people didn't have as many babies in the Bay Area, but we saw a huge decrease in obstetric-related medical legal claims. So our risk managers, when they started to realize that OB simulation was part of this team and culture improvements, they started really financially supporting us. And I found out that obstetric-related claims are one of the most expensive areas of claims. If you include us with neonatal claims, which are kind of secondarily related to us, where the biggest payouts come from our care. So there's luckily a huge amount of information out there for how you can improve patient safety. And simulation is just a very small, but I think very important part of that. So this is just a photograph to show how the anesthesiologist is very, very critical to many of the things that happen, the big crises that happens. This particular scenario was a postpartum hemorrhage scenario, and this is a senior anesthesia resident who is trying to coordinate those two nurses that are checking blood, and he's about to have to induce general anesthesia for airway protection because the patient's becoming unresponsive. And while he's doing that, he's trying to decide whether or not to transfuse and trying to get access and managing multiple priorities, which is a very, very big task. And as anesthesiologists, I think we recognize the things that we have to do and how high risk they are. But sometimes the obstetricians and the nurses and the technicians variably recognize that. So part of this building using simulation to build a culture shift is making everybody realize the most difficult parts of everybody's job. And this is just like a different camera view of the same situation. And the obstetrician is working in their own kind of special environment and not necessarily communicating to the anesthesiologist. And it's just so classic to kind of work in these silos, and we're constantly trying to build this teamwork because we can't take care of the patient without each other. So most of what I'll talk about to kind of break down some of the practicalities of running a simulation has to do with what you do before the simulation ever starts, the pre-simulation activities. And so I'm gonna talk about that a little bit, and I'll also talk about what to do for the actual simulation. And these are definitely not comprehensive. We certainly have a style that we like to use, but they work really well, and the whole idea is to just get out there and do something. Don't be too overwhelmed by this process. So when you're thinking about designing a simulation, the most important thing you can do is do a needs analysis of what you think is important or what leadership thinks is important, because that really should drive the activity. If it's not worth doing, there's no point. And developing your learning objectives based on that. And your scenario, everyone says, oh, do you have a scenario for postpartum hemorrhage, Dr. Austin? And I'm like, well, you don't really need me to hand you a scenario. That's not the hard part. The hard part is deciding what your needs are and who you're designing it for. And literally the most hardest thing is the session scheduling, because you have to decide when your participants are going to be available, because without them, you can't run a simulation. We'll get into these a little bit. For those of you who are nervous about designing a scenario, though, there's multiple tools that can help you. I just put a few of the most common ones up here: the Duke template, the Teach Sim, and then one that's part of our Stanford Immersive Learning Center template. So these are good starter tools for those people who do feel kind of overwhelmed by I want to run a postpartum hemorrhage drill, but I don't know how to write a scenario, because that can hold people up a little bit. And by far, I think the easiest approach to use when you're trying to design a simulation is what we call the Journalism 101 approach. So the five W's and an H. So you can tell the difference between an article you want to read in the newspaper or not based on how well they do these. And I personally like to start with the why, and I've touched on this already, because you can choose a real case or one that was because it was challenging, or one that led to particular morbidity or mortality, or one that even was bad enough that it needed a root cause analysis. But you can also choose something that's just based on practice improvement or things that the hospital or national organizations deem are important. Frequently, we'll choose common events, things like hemorrhage, that everybody is going to see and have experience with, but the teams need to be really well coordinated to go through that. Sometimes we'll do rare events that don't happen very often, and people may not have ever seen it in their training, and they may never see it in their practice in real life, something like an obstetric code and perimortem C-section. But if it does happen to them, it's very important that they do it. And one of the kind of increasing, exciting things that you can use simulation for is dealing with these new suggestions for protocols and bundles and checklists. Preeclampsia is one that we've run quite a bit, and I want to show you this video clip of a simulation for eclampsia. And I think this just, the audio is not very good, but I think it kind of captures how, if you were the clinician in real life in this moment, and you can imagine what that feels like, you realize that this is a very important thing for you to know how to deal with. So I'm going to ask Eric to go ahead and play this one, please.
160 over 100. Do you have a headache at all? You do. But I figured it was because I had an take at a very fast pace. Okay. Okay. Go ahead and call for help. All right, it's okay. She's just having a seizure. I'm going to turn her over.
And my heart races just thinking about the patients that I've seen have an eclamptic seizure when I'm working. And this is a nurse. She's playing the role of a standardized patient who has a seizure. She's obviously very talented, kind of Oscar award winning level in obstetric simulation, but you can just see that team just react in a very visceral way, and we couldn't accomplish this one as well with a plastic mannequin patient, but there are some simulations where you make those choices as the instructor, and you decide that this is the best way to show it. Now, she can't be intubated and given a big dose of benzo or propofol or whatever thing you would give to a mannequin, but you make those kind of choices along the way. So here's just a couple screenshots. I know it's kind of hard to see the projection, but these are examples of bundles and protocols that could be the basis of your why for your simulation. So the Council on Patient Safety, their bundles for things like venous thromboembolism and other things that cause major morbidity among pregnant women. Here's the CMQCC toolkits, which I think are really powerful. And they get at a lot of really important tools that you need to handle these emergencies, but they don't tell you necessarily how to implement them. And I think simulation is a really, it's mentioned as one of the ways to do it, but it's a really powerful way to make people in your work environment aware of the toolkits being introduced. And another, this kind of got touched on before, but how do you brief people when you're dealing with an emergency case? And there's increasing things on how to use these brief huddles and timeouts to kind of cut down that chaos in those moments. So after you figure out the why, you start to think about the who, because you don't have time, nobody has time to run a simulation for every type of who. And you have to really aim things and focus things for your faculty and for your participants. So it's very different to run a multidisciplinary simulation for people you're really focusing on the team and how the team performs, and you're not really getting into the nitty-gritty of the medical technical of how any one individual specialty has to do their job. You may do a breakout individually and teach nurses about Bacry balloons, or teach anesthesiologists about controlling hemorrhage during a preeclamptic GA induction. But when you're focusing on the team, it really changes your learning objectives. So when we have just anesthesiologists, we focus on these details, like how to run the oxygen machine, which apparently is going to be a big deal in a couple weeks when I'm the attending and they're turning off the oxygen supply for some kind of construction. So I'm going to have to go through this with my residents, apparently. Whereas if you're running something for the neonatologists or the nurses that are going to be helping support the neonatologists, you have a very totally different focus. And even though the scenario stem is the same, your learning objectives are going to be completely different than they would be for the anesthesiologists. And we run the gamut in terms of how we do this. One of the programs that I'm really proud of that we're doing is a multidisciplinary simulation in our real operating rooms in the adult hospital. And we're doing more and more of our high-risk cases in the non-obstetric unit because we need the surgical or nursing or other types of resources that we don't have on labor and delivery. So I am caring more and more about the teamwork that I need during a big OB case. So we're running a big program in the main hospital, which is daunting but really, really exciting. So this is I just love this because it's the nurses trying to move a patient urgently from a labor room to an operating room. And this is something that you don't learn about in a textbook. And you see that like all of them are stretching out their backs, and there's like so many systems issues that you can talk about here, so many ergonomics issues. And our simulation group has really uncovered some really interesting research and findings about the best way to take care of these women. Things like how it's very inefficient to move them onto a gurney just to get them to the operating room, how it's much better to just move them on their labor bed, even though it's a much bulkier bed. And by common sense, you wouldn't think that would be faster to move them down the hallway in this bulky bed. So things like this are things that we would have never discovered probably without simulations. I think it can be really powerful in ways that you don't even expect. And one of the kind of pro tips that I think is really important is that your job as a simulation faculty, or even as a faculty in general, is to constantly empower anyone to have a voice, because the people who are most stressed out in a moment of crisis are not going to be the ones who are going to have the free synapses to notice some of the important details. So if you have that nurse that's relatively not task saturated, she might notice something that would be incredibly helpful, or she might be able to help you find something that you really need badly. But unless they feel like they can speak up and be helpful, they won't use their voice. And communication is so critical to kind of any simulation, no matter who you're doing it for or why, because we kind of operate on the other side of this blood-brain barrier, and we kind of joke about it, but the reality is that communication between anesthesiologists and obstetricians is so important because of how dynamic the situations are. So no matter what simulation we're running, we always spend some time debriefing and talking about the communication. And that's very different sometimes than the kind of debrief you get in a non-formal simulation, because the classic kind of post-real crisis briefing is like, what went wrong and what was easy? And none of that has anything to do with communication, which is so critical. And when you're really trying to decide what to do with your simulation, you have to be careful not to get overwhelmed and get too into the details that you are personally biased for. So you really have to think about it and decide, distill down what are the most important take-homes, because your learners are already probably really stressed out that they have to do simulation that day, no matter how nice you are and how, how much work you put into it. You really just want to make sure that they go away with the most important things. And as an educator, this can be really hard to do because you just feel like you have so much that you want to get to them, but the reality is that they can't absorb it all. So you really want to focus on the most important things, both for the individuals and for the teams. And I'm just like constantly, no matter what instructor course I'm teaching for different providers, constantly trying to help them focus their debrief and focus their scenario on these most important points. So I welcome any of you guys to come to one of our instructor courses because they're really, really powerful for things like this. And how you actually design the scenario is up to you. In this particular, we have our Academy Award winning actress nurse again, and she's playing the body but not the pelvis of this woman who's probably gonna have a shoulder dystocia or big postpartum hemorrhage, and you can kind of tell that this one is aimed at empowering the OBs and the nurses to decide how to deal with a crisis before the anesthesiologist ever gets involved. And I think this is a really, the anesthesiologists aren't even really represented here, but I care about what happens in these moments because I walk into it after all this has happened. So you really want to teach the frontline providers how to line things up in a good way for us and call us. Like, it sounds really trivial, but sometimes we get called far too late. And so that's one of the things that you constantly work on. Communication again. So this, you can almost not even tell that that's a mannequin, I feel like, because everybody is so engaged, and you can tell by how blurry the picture is in some place that everyone's doing something. But it's classic again that everybody's kind of working in their silo, and you need to kind of bring people together and make them realize first that they're part of a team, that they have a voice, and that they can contribute to the care. And I like this show, Cosmos. I don't know if any of you guys watch it, but simulation is really a space and time odyssey because you have to get space and time in order to do these simulations. So sometimes when you have access to your learners is one of the most challenging things, and you have to decide as a faculty if you can manage to schedule things or if you have to do things ad hoc. And if you're just starting, I think it's probably better to do things in an announced and controlled way because it's a lot less daunting to people if they know there's a simulation that's going to be happening. And it's even better if they're not actually involved in clinical care, but that's a luxury that we don't always have. So my advice on this is to really just kind of start small and iterate. You don't need to cover all the nurses and all the doctors, or you don't need to worry if you cover the same doctor or nurse twice. Just do something. And if you gain traction and build street cred, I call it, you're going to actually make a lot of gains, and really focusing on quality above quantity for this. And working with your leadership is really important because if you're doing something that they find important, they're going to automatically give you more access to your learners and give you maybe even more protected time to get these things accomplished. So find out what they think is important and really sometimes go with those things and combine that with what you've done. When you're deciding where to run your simulation, you have lots of options. The simulation center is something that you can schedule and protect, but there's really lots of advantages to doing things on the real place with the real people and with all their real resources, because that feels more real to them. And if you are not able to get the real exact space, you can come up with backup plans. And I'll just show you a couple quick pictures of that. So this is like a simulation center, and you can almost kind of tell that it just doesn't look real, but it works if you get people to suspend their disbelief. This is a real, you can tell this is a real operating room, and we ran a fire simulation for like a stat C-section where they didn't have a bovie holder, so they just started a fire with their bovie on the drape. And sometimes if we couldn't run this in the real OR because we didn't have the availability, we would run it in a labor room to kind of set up a pop-up OR. And if that didn't work, we can run an OR simulation in like a conference room. This is like one of the family waiting rooms that we politely ask everyone to go to the other waiting room, and then we just kind of set it up as an operating room. And perhaps it's because we've been doing this for so long, but I think our providers, once they kind of get over the fact that it's a simulation, they almost don't even notice, and it makes them a little bit less on edge even. So with the limited time that I have left, I really want to kind of focus on how you can orient your learners, because that's huge for making them realize that you're there for them. You're not really there because your management wants you to be there, I hope. You're there because you care about your learners, and by default you care about what the patients get from your learners. So creating a space that's safe for everyone to learn is really important. And that's not just because they're learning new cognitive aids or checklists, but because they need mentally to feel really comfortable and safe. It's huge. And in order to kind of depersonalize it and make people realize that it's not about a test or something like that, we frequently use these crisis resource management key points about teamwork and dynamic decision making, because by making it about a team performance, it all of a sudden isn't about how I did in my performance or the things I did wrong. It's about what I did to contribute to the team. And it really kind of depersonalizes it, makes it a lot more safe for people to examine the system. And this is an excellent segue into Dr. Abir's talk about how anyone can find a systems issue, which is one of the other kind of pro tips, that if you teach people to look for systems issues in your simulation, they may see them a little bit more in real life, which is really important. I'm going to skip over those because she's going to talk all about them. And you have to take the things that you learn in simulation and transfer them to real life. And ours is by way of safety committee, which I think Dr. Abir will talk about, but they're the people who take the things we learn in simulation and make them real. And it is really true. I picked a bunch of shoe company slogans because I think they're really inspiring. You can make a difference. You don't have to cover every single nurse or every single doctor or every single thing that causes maternal morbidity or mortality. If you just inoculate people with the ability to work in a team, you will make a difference. And I think this is one of the most powerful things for me as a clinician and as an educator, is that it does matter, the effort that goes into things like this. So just do it, make things better. Don't think of it as impossible. Be happy. So for those of you who are interested, and I have listed a couple of resources that are for some of these things to help you depersonalize things, and this crisis management and anesthesiology is kind of the landmark book for CRM in anesthesia, and it has a bunch of really interesting obstetric related events. And I also have a couple references there for if you're interested in coming to one of our simulation courses, or you could just email me anytime if you have any questions about things. All right, 30 seconds left. Thank you very much.